Good afternoon, good morning, folks. This is the time to start our monthly webinar today. The topic is scaling and measuring Agile. I'll introduce the topic and then go over some logistics and introduce the speaker. And this is our once-a-month series of Agile webinars. The topic today is a very interesting topic. We are now year 12 into the Agile Manifesto. And at this point, a lot of teams have become fairly proficient in following Agile practices, and as we have been observing every year, every month, teams become more and more Agile. But one of the challenges that still seems to be out there is scaling Agile beyond smaller teams, and we'll go into more details of what the scaling means really, and that's, I think, the topic at hand today. We really focus on how to scale Agile across larger several hundred-person teams and multiple teams, and to still not lose the spirit and the effectiveness and how to measure Agile as you scale up. By way of logistics today, we'll have 35 minutes or so of the prepared presentation, as we do always, and we'll by and large hold questions for the end. But if you do have questions as you're going through the content which you feel are the pertinent question and should be handled, I'll pick that question up. But you can keep putting your questions along the way. I'll keep track of the questions in my job at the end. I'll go through salient questions that will amplify the content beyond what we covered. And at the end of the presentation, later today or tomorrow, you will receive a link, a follow-up email with a link to the webinar document also. And we are recording this webinar, so we hope to make the recorded version also available. So with that, let me introduce our speaker, Damon Poole. Damon is a regular presenter in these monthly webinars with us. I'm delighted to have Damon cover the scaling and measuring topic with us today. He has 20 years of experience across various sizes of Agile teams, from small co-located teams to large global teams of several hundred people. So he's the right person for us to be hearing from today. He was president of Agile New England from 2008 to 2010, and been the author and has written a book called Do It Yourself Agile, and in general has been a pioneer in the area of multi-stage continuous integration. He is a regular contributor, presenter at many Agile conferences. In fact, I think that's where Agile, Damon, you and I met first several years ago. So that's excellent. And he was co-founder and past CEO and CTO of AccuRev, where he created multiple award-winning products, including AccuRev and AccuWorkflow. So again, thank you so much, Damon, for taking the time to cover this topic with us. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Okay, so today we're going to talk about scaling Agile. And at the outset, it seems like a pretty simple topic, right? We're looking to go from one team where we've had success to multiple teams, but I think there's more to it than that. Now, this is a huge topic, and this is a webinar, right? So it's under an hour. There's only so much we can cover, and really just trying to get some concepts out there, a place to start when thinking about it. So we're going to cover scaling Agile, sort of straight on. Then we're going to get into issues around organizational support for scaling agility. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how do you measure success. So scaling Agile. What do we mean by scaling? When I was getting into Agile in the beginning, I was a little self-conscious when people said, well, does Agile really scale? And then I realized, wait a minute, let's ask the question, does traditional development scale? And generally when you ask that question, people tend to agree that, well, it doesn't scale as well as one might think in other areas, right? So if you think about scaling out your server farm, then you think, okay, well, I've got a rack of servers, and I put another blade in there, and if I add another blade, if I have one and I add another one, I'm going to double my capability, my scaling. But in traditional development, it doesn't tend to work that way. Things get more complicated, and you really have to add quite a few resources and a lot of sort of quote-unquote overhead in order to get more capability and get things out the door faster, or to get more things out the door in the same amount of time. So that's, we've really struggled with that as an industry. So what do we mean by scaling? It means that as you add more resources, you proportionally get more capacity for doing work. That's the goal. That's the holy grail there. And I'm not saying that Agile necessarily meets that holy grail, but in my opinion, it does actually do a better job of scaling out. But how? So, right, so getting a single team up and going these days, that's pretty well understood. Getting developers, QA, DBAs, UI designers, a Scrum Master, product owner, and everything put together in a team and delivering increments of value every month, it's pretty straightforward, right? Plenty of people have done that before. But now I've got 3 teams that are working sort of in the same area. They need to coordinate their actions, hit the same release targets, that kind of stuff. Now it starts to get more complicated, even with just 3. So what are some of the things that we can do there? Well, in my mind, the biggest difference here between traditional and Agile around scaling is finding and solving problems. Right? In traditional development, that becomes very difficult. If I don't actually surface the problem until a year or 2 years into something, who knows what caused it? That's really complicated. Unless it's glaringly obvious, it could be any number of things. Agile gives you the opportunity to find and make adjustments on the fly. We call that inspect and adapt. Now, I'm going to be talking specifically about things for improving the Agile process, not necessarily making a better product. The idea is that Agile will help you make a better product, but having the Agile process be better. So that's sort of self-healing. Now, if you look at things like Scrum and other things, there are some process improvement mechanisms out there. There's stand-ups, the so-called Scrumless Scrums, retrospectives, and stop the line, but they're very much individual practices. So one of the things that I've seen work out there in the field quite a bit and work really well is something that I like to call the escalation tree. Happy to call it something else, but this is what I happen to call it, the escalation tree. And it incorporates all of those other practices, but in a systematic way, right? So one organization that I worked with that started out with 40 teams and is now scaled up into the multiple hundreds of teams, they have this practice where they call the escalation tree the S1, the S2, and the S3. So the S1 is the idea of a stand-up. All of the teams have a stand-up at a regular time. That makes it easier for them to, right after that, have the next meeting. So in that next meeting, they get together the Scrum Masters from the individual teams and say, what's going on? What's happening in your neck of the woods? The same 3 questions, right? And then what impediments are there? And you can see they have status, basically. They use a tool to do this, but it doesn't really matter how you're getting it as long as you're getting it. These teams, fine. These teams, well, might be running into a few problems, and then we've got some teams that actually have specific problems that they need to deal with. Right? So let's find those, talk about them, get owners on them, and then bring it to the next level. Folks are standing by, ready, right after this meeting to find out what problems there are. Now, if you're in management, if you're in leadership, you're an executive, you might be thinking, oh, great, just what I need, another meeting, and this one you're telling me is going to be every day. Well, but we're going to trade here, right? So you've probably already got some meeting that you're doing today that's really long, and you're handed a whole bunch of problems, right? Now you get a whole bunch of problems in this long meeting. So the idea is that if you want the benefits of rapid turnaround of product, then we're going to need rapid turnaround of problem resolution too. So you can cancel that monthly meeting, whatever it was, right? Maybe you still have it, but it's just going to be sort of a sanity check that, yep, we don't have any problems since this morning's meeting, which we have, every day. So the team is going to bring to you problems as soon as they occur. And the other thing that we're going to do here is we're going to look for patterns and do root cause analysis and try to figure out what keeps coming up all the time so we can get rid of it. And in a traditional environment, that's really hard to do. You end up running into the same problem over and over again, and it can be hard to figure out what it is. So we're not saying more work. We're saying let's restructure how we find and resolve problems.
Now, from this page, there's one question that was on the previous page that we should take it right here. You use the term stop the line. So the question is, what is stop the line? Can you describe
okay,
that?
Sure. So that's something that comes from Lean. People may be familiar with the Toyota production system, and the idea is that you've got a line of cars on the production, the assembly line there, and something's going wrong, and there's a cord that anybody can pull. You pull it down, and it stops the production line, and then you go and fix the problem, and you start the production line up again. So the idea there is that, why wait until a retrospective to service a problem? So that was just sort of a list of the typical things that are out there for inspect and adapt.
Right, thanks. There's another question on this page itself. Let's also take that so we can keep up with you. So the question is how to handle the S1 meetings if there are shared resources among the teams, that is data security.
Sure. So shared resources amongst the team is probably a whole topic all by itself. Why don't we hold that to the end?
Okay.
Shared resources. Good question. All right. So this same pattern can be followed at the retrospectives, right? So one of the typical patterns that I've seen out there is that you have a team retrospective, and then that's it. So if you have multiple teams, what you want to do is you want to schedule a team of teams retrospective. Do the exact same thing. Say, hey, you know what? There were problems that we found that I as an individual can take care of. We as a team will take responsibility for. There's something that we can't do that perhaps another team can help us with. There's a dependency or there's some process problem that keeps coming up. Let's talk about it in the retrospective of retrospectives. And one of the things that might happen there is everybody says, oh, you're having that same issue? Interesting, right? It's not a good thing that everybody's having a similar issue, but at least now you can work together and say to whoever, an executive or somebody in leadership, we're all having this problem. This is causing a lot of downtime. This needs to be fixed immediately. It's very high impact. So why not? And sometimes people do have a release retrospective, and that's great. But often that sort of devolves into a retrospective of that day. But you want to have a retrospective of your overall process as an organization. And that's a similar pattern that you can take here. Okay. So if we're looking at an overall model, it's actually very useful when you're doing an Agile transformation or you're scaling Agile out to sketch out or map out. It doesn't have to be quite as elaborate as this. Exactly how do you run things there? It's good to have a picture. So adding to my picture here, you have the escalation tree where teams get together and that escalates all the way up to the top. So I'm not going to go through all of the potential scaling techniques I know of. I'm really only going to cover two here, but it's to give you an idea of some of the things that you can do, and they're my two favorites, right? So the escalation tree, and then also something called one-piece flow. You may or may not have heard of it. Another name for it is small batch size. It doesn't actually mean that there's just one thing moving through. It means that to the extent that you can, you're trying to move as few things through the system as you possibly can. And why is that important? We'll get to that in a moment. But if you look at any particular thing that you need to get out of the door, whether you think of it as a requirement or a feature or a bug fix or a capability or a story, it doesn't really matter. A change to the system doesn't come out of nowhere, right? You have to say, this is what I want. Here's a sort of plan for how to do it. Here's who's going to do it. Here's what's going to be done. Actually do it. Integrate it with the system. Test it. Document it. And that documentation may be, something that you need for audit, governance. It may be end-user documentation. Whatever you need to do to document it, then show it to whoever's going to approve it, whether you're doing UAT or you're showing it to an actual customer, to get your side of the contract, to get revenues or whatever, to get sign-off, and then to declare, hey, this is done. And that might be product-wide or not, right? If you're saying that this product is done, it has 100 new features in it, then you're saying that for each of those individual features it's done. But you could think about all those steps on a story-by-story basis. So when you do that, if you look at what people typically do in Agile when they're getting going, one of the problems that you run into is illustrated here. So I got a whole bunch of stories, and what people often do for quote-unquote operational operational efficiency reasons is to say, hey, while I'm in there, these 2 or 3 stories are very similar. I'm going to work on them all at the same time. Seems like a good idea. The problem is that then you end up doing a whole bunch of design all at once, then a whole bunch of coding all at once, and a whole bunch of integration all at once, yada, yada. If you squint and look at this, what do you see? Waterfall. That's right. Doing things in stages, so Agile really is not, this is a common misunderstanding, it is not doing the traditional process of waterfall in smaller increments. Right? That's not the point here. What you really want to do is something of one piece flow, small batch size, where you're working on as few stories as you possibly can and getting them done ASAP. Right? One way to look at that is that every single story is a hotfix or patch. Right? And what gets in the way of a hotfix? Exactly. Nothing. Right? Because it's the most important thing that if something's down, it's the most important thing that you could possibly do, providing the most possible value to fix it and get it out there. Right? So, Joe wrote it and he's on vacation. Well, we'll just wait. Well, you won't. You're going to get it done, right? Because that's where the most value is. That's not true of just hotfixes. That's true of everything. Why would you sit on value that needs to get out the door for any reason? And maybe you only get once a year, but it doesn't matter. At the end of the year, you want to have the most value available at the end of that year to give to somebody, right? Because if you don't ship, then it was all cost. So you want to be getting to done on as few stories as possible as fast as you possibly can. And it turns out that while that may, quote unquote, not be as operationally efficient as you want, from a market and business and economic perspective, it is the most efficient way to do things. Right? Because reducing costs, that's great. If I can save $1, that's fantastic. But what if I actually am losing the opportunity to make an extra $100 by saving that dollar? That doesn't make any sense. Right? We want to get to value as soon as we possibly can. Another way to look at it is, well, which would you rather have? At the end of the iteration, would you rather have 10 stories out of 10, 80% done, or 8 stories out of 10, 100% done? I think the answer is obvious there. Okay, so what does this look like? This is what Agile looks like in action when you're doing one-piece flow, right? You've got a continuous flow of requests that you're organizing in your backlog, that you're getting to done as fast as you possibly can, getting them integrated, getting a product ready to ship. Whether you actually ship it every iteration or not, if you're following this, you could even ship at the end of a story, or at least be ready, right? So you can show it to somebody. That has a lot of value. So if you're a product manager and you want to show it to somebody or a product owner, then when a story is done, typically everything's sort of open, right? The patient is open on the operating table, so you really can't show it to anybody. You take a risk that some other thing is going to fail, so wait. Right? But if you're doing things in the one-piece flow or small batch size manner, then you have something done, really done and ready to show to somebody at the end of every story. Now, again, that's not the easiest thing in the world, but now if I can do this with one team, that means I don't have to wait until the end of an iteration to integrate with somebody else. Why should I? Right? So if it's the end of an iteration, it's a month long, it takes me a month to discover that I have an integration problem and then another month to fix it. Maybe it's another month before it's really fixed because I ran into some other problem. And so if you're doing this at scale, then one-piece flow is a technique that really helps with scalability because it is, if things are working perfectly here, then that means you really are scalable and you're getting to value very quickly. If you have a problem at any point, you're going to know right away, hey, I couldn't get that story done. I know it now. Hey, I couldn't integrate that story that I just got done with the work from the other teams. I know it now. Why? All there was, build machines. Why? Go get the problem fixed right now. Right? So problems are discovered and fixed immediately, or not, but that's your choice. You can either ignore the problem or fix it. That's your choice. Right? So these are two techniques that I have found work really, really well. Okay, so there's another sort of background issue here that I've really seen as a pattern that I believe gets in the way of true scalability of Agile, which is that very often, Agile I think started out as, hey, it's a team thing. People think of standing up teams. I want to stand up 50 teams, 10 teams, 3 teams, whatever it is. It's more than one. Well, scaling Agile is actually about something, a little deeper than that as well. So the issue here is that if your organization is purpose-built for doing things in the traditional way, then it is going to favor traditional development methods, and it is going to work against Agile. So let's look at this from just sort of an analogy, right? So I've got my team, and they're doing traditional development. They're not doing Agile development, and they've got all kinds of support from them, from the organization, the way metrics are done, the way the organization is structured, all that kind of stuff is helping them, lifting them up to be traditional. So now, if I want to go in the other direction towards Agile development, all of those things that were headwinds, were tailwinds, are now headwinds. They are preventing me from getting to where I want to go. Now, if I work really hard, right, I can get there anyway. I can work around those problems. I can cope with it. I can adapt. But doing that at the team level, it's hard. So I stand up a team, and I stand up more teams, and I still have all those same impediments. And we'll get into what they are in a moment. Right? So that's maybe not the best way to go about it. I have seen time after time organizations that I get engaged with, and they say, hey, we're going Agile. I say, well, that's great. First time? No, it's our second time, our third time. Yeah, okay, that's not surprising. That happens all the time. One organization I'm working with right now, a very large organization, they're standing up hundreds of teams. This is their third shot at it. This time, they are actually making changes to the organization. And the previous 2 times, they hadn't made a single change at the organizational level. They had just stood up teams. And after standing up, I don't know, probably 50 teams over the last 10 years, a very small number of them are actually still in existence and operating. In fact, they have more of sort of an Agile underground, people that really liked it, want to get back to it, but aren't doing it today. So one thing you can do to cope is you can say, I'm really going to get this team super adapted to the way things are. They're going to work around things like you wouldn't believe. But all that effort that they put into working around things is a drag on them. It is still taking away from where they could be. And this may be, expensive. Right? So you could set up all kinds of, build machines and get all this tooling and all this exotic stuff to work around the fact that the organization has not changed. Much better, change the organization and lift up those Agile teams, and that will also help other teams go Agile. It becomes easier and easier, right? The system is working for you. All right, so this has been very conceptual. Let's get into some of the exact things I'm talking about here. I'm going to give you 10 examples at a high level, but I'm going to go into detail on a couple of them. So one of the big ones is misaligned and functional goals. By functional goals, I mean you have silos, right? So it doesn't really matter what's in these silos, but let's say it's product development, product management, product owners, architects, business analysts, developers, testers, what have you, all organized by function. And they've got a couple of projects that they get out that they're each working on. And at the functional level, they all have their goals. We found, the quota of bugs. We wrote the desired number of lines of code, and we got that functionality written, coded. We created the requirements documents. But the projects were failures, right, in some way, shape, or form. That means, you at the functional level, you succeeded, but as far as the customer is concerned, they don't really care what happened behind the scenes. They feel like you failed. And that is something that has to do with how the organization is structured. Right? So if you want to change the results, you have to change the system. So the thing that I've seen succeed the most, and this is not easy, it takes time. Just because they say it's a good idea doesn't mean you can do it overnight. But this is something that if you learn about, I think you get excited about, you'll find motivation to start making changes in this direction. So moving away from functional goal to managing by business value delivery, compensating people based on whether or not product is shipping, right? If the customer is happy, it doesn't really matter if you sort of, checked all the boxes if the customer's not happy. You want to measure whatever your business value is, however you measure that, you want to look to that. Now, that's not easy, and often that's after the fact, but you want to move in that direction. And one way to measure that is the assumption that if you have a story done and it's shipping, that it has value. If it doesn't, then what are you doing? You'll find out till later. But measuring whether or not and how much you're actually shipping from the story perspective, yes, we got all the stories done, or we didn't. We got all those, we got 50% of stories shippable that we expected or not. That is measurable. So that's what you want to do, and you want to align everybody connected to that and within the line of business to that exact same goal, right? So we're all rowing in the same direction. So what does that look like? There's a couple of different ways to do that, right? So you can have secondary goals, but maybe have to be a percentage of the overall, and have primary goals around, did we get the project out there? Are we making the customer happy? Are we shipping stuff? Are we getting to shippable or not? A fairly large change to make here is not just sort of a matrix organization change by changing how the goals are, but actually physically changing the organization. And this is, I forget the exact name of the law, I think it may be Conway's law. It says that your products, the architecture, will match the organizational structure, and I think that's very true here as well. Now, sometimes this can be an awkward topic, right? So people have two thoughts. Well, if we change the line of business, that means I'm managing not just, I'm a QA person, I'm a VP of QA. Me managing developers, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Well, it's probably better to be managing around business value delivery than managing around, did I find the right number of bugs or did I write the right code? Right? And those team management skills can be leveraged across multiple disciplines. You may still have folks that are specialists of, yes, I manage this line of business, but I also mentor on the QA side. I'm responsible for making sure that our QA practices are good. And sometimes people think, well, I don't know how to do this, and I'll probably bring in somebody else that can. I'm not sure who that is, right? Because it's not like a lot of people have experience doing this sort of thing before. It's got to be you, right? The other thing that people think is, well, I have 50 people reporting to me now, or 100 or whatever it is that going to change? Nope. You're still going to get the work done, right? It's just that you're going to have more than one discipline reporting to you. And, I'm not saying that everybody does this that goes Agile. What I'm saying is that more people are starting to do it. And the organizations I've worked with that are successful, they tend to be either here or moving there. And again, it's not something you can do overnight, but you can do it piece at a time. All right. So those were just two things there. Here's basically my favorite top 10. Right, so the various areas, and then how it's done in traditional projects, and then how ideally it's done in an Agile project. And my sort of rule of thumb here is that if you need to do more of these for Agile than traditional if you really, really want to succeed at Agile in the long term. Very often people stand up a bunch of teams, and then after a year or two, sometimes people say, well, this is tough. Can we maybe go back on this, go back on that? Because the overall organization is pushing you in that direction. So if you get at least half of these towards the Agile side, you're going to be in good shape, and it's going to more likely be sustainable. Right? So moving from project-based to product-based, right? Time and time again, one of the things I see out there is you've got, my favorite example was this one group I was talking to. They had 7 different teams, quote unquote. I counted people in seats. It was 15 people. Right, so if you've got a 9-person team and seven teams, and that looks like a whole bunch of people, but it was only 15, right? So that's because they had a whole bunch of projects with teams that weren't really teams. And so you move to a product and you say these teams are working on these products, period. Another big thing that runs that I see as a pattern out there is people think of IT as a cost center. Business and IT, big handoffs. No daily interaction, that's got to change, right? So all of these down the line are the kinds of things that get in the way of going Agile and staying Agile. Changing funding. A big one is If I'm going to commit $5 million to this project, I'm absolutely going to get that requirements document, and it's going to be fully scoped out before I say yes. Okay, but if we can deliver incrementally, then why not do it in tranches? All right, so invest $1 million, and if it goes well, invest another. If not, why would you keep investing? Go use that money for something else instead of saying after $5 million of funding, forget it. Then that was $5 million of cost and no reward. What are you going to do with the thing that's not finished? Nothing. Okay.
Let's take it, if you can, at this page before you move from that page of your 10 list.
Sure.
So is there an implied priority on these 10 topic areas, meaning if an organization is wanting to do the transformation, which ones are more important than the others?
That's an excellent question. I would have to say that I don't have a strong feeling on that, other than I think one of the ones that sort of emerged for me is getting to dedicated teams. That seems to be behind a lot of that. Things become clearer. Some of the other issues become clearer if you organize around teams rather than people working on quote unquote 3 different teams. And it really, in my experience, it really depends on what the organization is ready for. The organization might say, wow, most of these look tough, but we were thinking about changing funding. So whatever in your organization you feel like you're going to get the most support for, make that change. Then it will make all the other things easier and clearer, and you'll have extra motivation. And then it might turn out that something that you thought was impossible, now you have support for. So find a couple and just start. You can't do them all at the same time. You won't be successful in that. So pick a couple, depending on your organization, what makes sense, you think you can actually do, and start there.
And perhaps metrics also, it will seem to me, if you measure the team base, would start prioritize that high, that would also be a good place to start.
Absolutely. Changing how you spend millions of dollars, that's hard. Changing how you measure is not that hard, and you can keep the old metrics and start with new metrics, and keep them around. It's not that much extra effort. Good point. Okay. So the next thing I would suggest along the same lines is that it's good to have an overall picture of what you're going to be doing. And so here's one example. Your mileage may vary, but I think having something like this sketched out and talked about and agreed upon as far as the goal is really good. So here's one example. So we already sort of sketched out this part up to here. But you want to have an Agile audit, which is a group of people that are tasked with the overall progress of your actual transformation, whether that's external consultants or internal champions, doesn't really matter. You want a group of people that are getting together and looking at the work for doing the transformation as an Agile project. There's work to be done, there's a backlog to be created, etc. If you have multiple teams working within the same line of business, then those product owners should meet on a regular basis to coordinate. You're going to have the delivery manager that I talked about that's overall responsible for everything here, so you can't say, well, it's dependent on QA. They own QA. You want to be doing the metrics that we're talking about, right? And then that's going to be integrated into your release train, right? So, okay, I couldn't make this release, I'll make the next one, and then you've got a team of folks that are working on that, the release team. You eventually get the stories, but you got to start somewhere, so you have those epics. And they, whether they're sketched out or fully developed, and I would actually suggest more of the sketching out. You start with epics, and then you assign those to teams. They break them down into user stories. There would be a product manager, and different organizations use different terms. You may use product manager, product owner, BA, BSA, SA, all kinds of terms. But at the end of the day, sort of on the front end, you have somebody that's more customer, stakeholder, business, customer market oriented. The person typically that's sort of getting on planes or spending a lot of time with the actual product. And then you have the folks that are in the trenches, the product owners. So generally, you have sort of 2 people working together there. Then you have the line of business and its market or customers that are interacting with that person. That product, you're going to measure the how much product you're producing for that line of business's market, and then you're going to do that, within each of these lines of business. PowerPoint can only go so far. in one organization I'm working with, they have 12 lines of business, and a couple of those lines of businesses have over 100 teams within it. So from an organizational perspective, an organization, forget about Agile, can only scale up any particular piece of that organization so far, right? So having 100 departments in a line of business, it's a little unlikely. But it's going to hit natural limits there. And it's the same for Agile. So you want to find some sort of organizing entity to organize around, and a line of business is a very common one. So a couple hundred teams within a line of business, that's fairly manageable. Nobody really goes beyond that. There's some other way that it's broken down, right? So here I've got 3 different lines of business. You've got line of business leaders, all working on different topics, and then they're coordinating too, right? Because if you have a single release train, you want to coordinate that to some degree, and even though they're different lines of business, they may depend on each other. All right, so that's, and then of course you've got architecture in there, right? And you've got the management oversight and the escalation. So whatever it is, you want to sketch that out for your organization and have that sort of end state, and that will help you think about how you're going to get there. And then ideally, and this I think is fairly motivating, traditional development can be looked at very much as gridlock. It takes a really long time to get from here to there. As far as the customer's from your perspective, things are maybe moving really well, but from a customer's perspective, it's taking forever for them to get what they want. So, Nirvana looks a little bit like this. Problems found and fixed as soon as they come up. Multiple lines of business, getting customer commands in there, getting it created, integrated, and to the customer as soon as you possibly can. Right? And then you're going to be delivering more value more frequently, and that's good for everybody. So how do you measure success? Well, that's a little trickier, right? You can't necessarily know up front that you're making more money, but there are a number of things that you can do. Right? So you can say, we know that to get our organization agile is an important ingredient for eventual success, so let's spend some time looking at that. And so for every single one of those 10 things that I outlined as a headwind/tailwind, using compensation as an example, you can put together, where might we be starting out, where do we want to end up, and some things in the middle. And here's an example of one that we put together that we use. That you might start out impeded, so compensation is individual-based, and people are discouraged from helping out with the transformation, right? Because, hey, you didn't meet this goal, you were working on that other thing, I don't really care about that, do that in your spare time. That's going to make it hard for people to actually spend time on the transition, right, the transformation. So you want to map out, for your organization, what does success look like, and how are we going to move this forward? And then you can measure this. You can say, yep, we're about here with this team, about here with, with this division or organization, or the enterprise overall, and say, what do we want to attack next? And then you can use this as a dashboard as well. So here's an example of something that we use at the team level, all kinds of things, and this is something that you can sketch out on your own, what's important to you. As an example, sort of drilling into this, you can look at the process mechanics. Just if you're looking to go agile and you're not even having stand-ups on a particular team, well, maybe that's a problem, right? So, again, you can use this as a dashboard and say, here are some areas that aren't going so well. Here are some that are sort of getting there, that are in transition. And, for some of these, in the case of sustainable means that if, if you've got a coach in there working, if the coach steps away, these areas are probably going to stay there, and that part is sustainable. But if you're working with a coach and they step away, these other things may cause the team to backslide. Something to be aware of. And for instance, this is something that we use to tell whether or not it's time for a coach to move to another team or not. So at the end of the day, really, what you want to measure for success is profits. Okay? If you're more profitable or creating more business value, I would bother. What would be the point? It's like saying, hey, we're gonna switch from the company standard is English to the company standard is French. I mean, you're still going to get business done. Is it going to increase profits? Probably only if you're working with France. What would be the point of that? Same thing with Agile. but just going Agile, quote unquote, is not a purpose in and of itself. Your organization should be making more profits. Now that's a trailing indicator, right? So another thing that people do is they do the Net Promoter Score, which is gaining a lot of popularity lately. You'd see that all over the time. You'd see surveys asking you, would you recommend this to friends or colleagues on a scale of 0 to 10? That's called the Promoter Score. That's a great way to measure whether or not you're making progress. Below that, if on the business side you don't have people saying, wow, I was able to produce more of what the customer wanted quicker, and that doesn't mean the same amount of stuff in less amount of time. It just means things that are more important to the customer and actually get it to the customer. If you don't have anecdotes like that, something's wrong. Now, before you get to that point, the only thing you can really measure is the capability of the organization. Things like, are we actually hitting good standards, holding good standards, other retrospectives working well? Are we making organizational changes? Right? Again, the idea there is if you're moving towards Agile and having success in adopting it, then the anecdotes should follow, your Net Promoter Score should go up, and then you should start recognizing more revenue. So there are a couple of other metrics I like, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. Shippability is a very, very simple metric. You say, hey, for this particular team, they said they were going to ship 10 stories with 3 story points each, and they were actually only able to get 5 stories done at 15 out of 30. That's 50%. That's not good. That's really not good, right? So yes, you wrote a lot of code and a lot of tests and all that, but what good is that? If I give you a piece of paper with a printout with code on it, what are you going to pay me for it? What are you going to pay me for it? Nothing, right? It has no value. I need something that's actually in production for it to have any value. So shippability is an easy metric. Work in progress. Do I have a lot of work in progress? Because I got to tell you, if you have a lot of work in progress, it's very likely that a lot of that work is not going to get done. So you want to minimize your work in progress. And if you have a lot, that's bad. If it's very small, that's good. Another easy metric. Cycle time is, I believe, with shippability, one of the most important metrics out there, and it really helps with scaling and transforming to Agile to know whether, to focus people on the right thing. So one organization I was working with, they were shipping, basically major stuff every 2 years. From hey, we need to do this, to there it is, 2 years. And the edict came down that they needed to get to 3 months. And so where that was interpreted was from we're ready to develop to we have something developed needs to be 3 months. So what they were really doing was they had gotten this process down to 7 months. And I got to tell you, 7 months is a heck of a lot better than 2 years, right? So whether you go Agile or not, just saying, you know what, we're going to take the overhead hit of doing the preparation, integration, and testing over and over again 3 times in those 2 years, that's actually better, whether you do Agile or not, because you're getting more customer value, more business value out there to the market. The overhead is cost, right? It's the dollar saved versus $100 made, or, I'm not promising $100, but whatever it is, it's going to be more. There's upside there. So what you want to say is, what kind of cycle time do we want between when we ask for something and it's actually in production? And that helps the people that are actually making the change happen focus on the right things. If that cycle time is not going down, it's not the right thing. Right? So you want to look at, for example, if it takes me a month to prepare for the team to actually do something, and then a month for them to get it ready to ship, and in the iteration, at the end of the iteration, it should be shippable. If not, we need to talk. Right? Shippable, ready to put it in production. So in that case, that's a 2-month cycle time. Right? So what the edict was looking for was a 3-month cycle time, not 7 months. Right? So it's very important to be clear about what you mean about the cycle time. A number of companies I've talked to say that they ship every month, and that sounds great. But the thing that they're not telling you is that they have 3 to 5 releases in progress, in parallel at the same time. And their cycle time was more like 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. Right? That's not a monthly cycle time. Right? So measuring this is very important to see whether or not you're actually making progress and focuses people on the right things to do. So very quickly, a little bit about Eliassen, a little bit about Synerzip, and then we'll take questions. So at Eliassen, in the Agile practice, our approach is to take a multi-layered approach. At the end of the day, if you're trying to go Agile, you have a whole bunch of people that you're trying to bring new skills to. It doesn't really matter how you do it, whether it's classroom training or reading a book or coaching or, you got a magic wand that works. I don't have one of those, but if you did, it doesn't really matter as long as people get those skills. So rather than say, hey, here's a bunch of training, good luck, or here's a bunch of coaching all the time, and that can be expensive, is to say we're going to take a multi-layered approach. So we can do large-scale classroom training, and in the picture there you can see at Agile 2012, we were training 11 teams simultaneously, and they really liked it. It actually works out quite well, right? Rather than train just a few people and have them come back, and people look at them like they've got two heads, everybody for the same experience, and that's very reasonably priced as well. As experts, we can do targeted workshops. We do coaching at not only the individual team level, but also the leadership level, right up to the executive. And we produce an Agile sustainability program so that when we're done, we're not saying, wow, we don't want to use that training as they've done, and it's customized. Their coaches are gone, we don't know what to do. You've got coaches now. So we make sure that we leave behind a sustainable Agile program. And with that, I will turn it over to Hima.
Thank you, Damon. So what we'll do at this stage is we have a number of questions in our backlog already, but if you guys can reflect on the content of scaling and measuring Agile and add any other questions you may have on this topic. And while you're doing that, I'll go through a short introduction of Synerzip, and then we'll go to the questions. So this page will cover Synerzip in a nutshell. So give me a minute to bring up my PowerPoint. You can actually see. You all can see my screen. Can you? And not yet. So show my screen. I should have been more ready for this page transition. I apologize, but I think we are at this point. Okay. So Synerzip in a nutshell, we are a software product development partner for small to mid-sized technology companies, and for each company, we put together a dedicated team, and that team serves as an extension of our client's in-house team, and we do complete software development lifecycle or sometimes help in a specific aspect of software development, such as just development or just QA and testing, but usually we are an extension of our client's team. And we are big proponents, as most of you are a regular participant to these webinars, we are big proponents of Agile practices. And we feel Agile is an excellent way to build quality software, deliver value early, and it's a good balance of a responsive process, yet a fairly disciplined process of testing and ensuring quality. So through that combination, we're able to reduce the risk of software development for our clients. In addition, we are also able to reduce the cost of software development given our dual shore team. We have a design, development, and testing team based in India, and a product management team based here on the US side. And with that combination, we are able to provide significant, typically 50% cost advantage for clients. And last thing is flexibility. We work as a partner with our client, and any of our partners, when they're ready, they can transition their team as their capital operations. So they have the full flexibility. So that's Synerzip in a nutshell. This page, next page, as it refreshes on your screen, shows the number of our clients, typically small to mid-sized software. These are our clients. With that, let's just turn back our attention to the topic at hand, which is scaling Agile. So the number of questions given, let's start with the first question, which we put on the hold, which is, how do you handle shared resources among the teams?
Okay, so at the meta level, one of the questions that I often hear, and there's nothing wrong with that, it's a perfectly valid question, is how do I continue to do what I used to do in traditional development, but now in an Agile way? And the simple answer to that is very often, you don't. To get the benefits or the change result from Agile, it does actually require making changes. And so one of the hard things do there, as an example, is to say, well, I have a bunch of shared resources. Is to say, let's actually put those resources. I'll give you an example. One group I was working with had 10 folks in the sort of DBA area, modeling and whatnot, and they had 20 teams. But there were just over 10 teams that had the heavy database component. And while it was very comfortable to have a database team, what they've started to do is move those individuals into the team so that the norm is that they are dedicated to teams. The exception is that they work with another team. As opposed to in a traditional model, the exception is that they work with a team, and the norm is that it's not always possible to do that. And in that case, in the Scrum of Scrums area, it was the Scrum Master bringing the issue to the Scrum of Scrums, not necessarily somebody that's a shared resource. They may say that for this particular problem, they're going to bring the shared resource. And I guess the other question is if that shared resource is on multiple teams. It doesn't necessarily matter if they're in all of the stand-ups day in and day out. And then another thing you can do is you can say, well, in this case, if we just sort of stagger it a little bit so that we've got a whole bunch at 9 and then some at 9:15 and then some at 9:30, and then we have the next meeting at 10, then that's not too bad. The idea is to have those meetings as close together as you possibly can. And you can't always hit the ideal state. But to the extent that you can, the closer you can get to that pattern, the better off that you will be.
Let's take the next question, Damon, which is you touched upon a number of metrics in your discussion. But the question here is, how do you measure value delivery at an executive level? What would the dashboard look like?
Yeah, you can't. Simple answer to that is you can't. The value is a trailing indicator, or a lagging indicator. The only way you can measure value is by looking at your revenues, and that takes time. And then where did the value come from? Maybe it was marketing got better. Maybe sales got better. Maybe the product did more of what the customer wanted. Maybe the economy improved. Maybe the economy got worse. That's not something that you can easily measure. What you can do, however, is that you can measure how many containers of value am I shipping, right? So if I, just making an example for one team, that team has a velocity of 40 story points. That means that on a regular basis, they're getting 40 story points of work done. I don't know what the value is, but if they don't have anything shippable, it doesn't matter what the value is because it's going to be zero because they can't get it out there. And so measuring the health of the engine itself is very important, right? So if you've got a car that needs to go in the shop, you're not going anywhere, right? If you've got a car that's in good shape, you can get places. Where you drive to, that choice is yours, right? And so the value that you put in those containers, that's up to you, and you can only measure that after the fact. But you can measure whether or not you're getting things out the door, and that's really all you can do. And I would say it's not so much the velocity. Often people fudge velocity. I think the thing you want to measure is how many story points did you get done for stories that were done in the same iteration that they started. That's the thing to focus on.
Okay. Let's take a couple of related questions right now. In your content, you touched upon scaling beyond 200 teams and line of business being roughly a few hundred people or 100 or so. So can you talk a little bit about this question, which is how do you really scale beyond to several hundred people? I mean, is there is the same answer? Is there some variation there? And then how do you allocate the backlog of features across teams? Is there a common backlog each team picks up from it? Is there a backlog separated by each team? So how do you handle backlog allocation across these scale teams?
Okay, so I guess that was kind of two questions. So So on the first one, I just want to clarify, actually, I wasn't saying people, I was saying teams. So the example I was giving was 12 lines of business, and some of those lines of business had multiple, they had over 100 teams. Those teams comprised of between, I had around 9 people per team, somewhere around there. So that was more on the order of 500 to 1,000 person people per line of business. So I've seen it scale up very well there. And I think the other question to ask is, again, to get back to traditional development, if you've got thousands of people, what are you doing to scale it today? And often there aren't really scaling mechanisms in there per se. It's just you keep working on it until it's ready to go. And yes, you have a PMO, and yes, you have a project plan, and yes, you have all that kind of stuff. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going, stellar, which is one of the reasons that people look to Agile. But at the end of the day, there's no simple answer. Organizations, regardless of Agile, have to structure themselves in such a way that they can actually get things done. And people can only manage so many people. Products can only be so complex before it's too complex for anybody to deal with. You have to break it down some way. And really, I hate to sort of dodge the question a little bit there, but it really depends. Different organizations have different problems. So one organization that I worked with had 25 different technologies that they had to deal with. Many of the products that they were producing had to work with 7 to 10 of those. And so as a result, some of those platforms had 100 people working on them. And so, and this sort of ties into your question about backlog as well. In that particular circumstance, what they did was they broke up the platform teams into per platform component teams, and those component teams were each an Agile team. But they served specific feature teams. So in the example of 150 people, they broke it up into about 15 component teams, each of which could work on that same platform, and then they were bundled into a few feature teams. So within a line of business, there was the epic level, and epics got divided out to different teams based on what they were capable of. Those teams would then break it down into their individual backlogs and manage that individual backlog. And then they would put requests into the component teams, creating a backlog of, several teams might actually put things in the backlog for a particular component team. A component team would have a product owner that would work with the multiple feature teams to figure out what made most sense and coordinate when those things got delivered. But so that answer happened to work for that organization with those particular circumstances, but there is no simple answer. It's much like asking, for my organization, how would I implement Java, right? How would I implement pretty much anything? It really, for something like that, it very much depends. It's very complex. There's no simple answer.
Let's take a question, which is, since the sizing story is relative by the Scrum team, is there a problem with comparing points shift from one team to another?
Absolutely. I think this translates to something that I think we all understand. So at the end of the day, when you're asking with velocity, what is a story point? It's a measure of an amount of capacity that a team has. And eventually that maps back to a number of dollars spent. So it's kind of like asking how many dollars is this team spending versus that team. That doesn't actually make any sense. So, you can do it, right? You can put numbers in a spreadsheet and do it, but it's kind of nonsensical. It's like saying, I have 1,000 fruits. Some of them are pineapples, some of them are oranges, some of them are apples. It doesn't make any sense. The only thing that story points are useful for is an indicator of there are problems or not, right? So is the velocity staying the same? Is it going down? Is it going up? So aggregating story points doesn't really make a lot of sense. What I was talking about earlier with measuring shippability, that's on a team-by-team basis, and that's really as far as it goes.
A few more questions, but let's take one final one, which is a good question to summarize in the webinar, which is, what is the single biggest organizational impediment to scaling Agile in your opinion?
I would say the largest impediment there is understanding. It's sort of a two-part answer. It's understanding what Agile is and understanding its benefit. It's not clear to me that the true value of Agile is widely understood. I think often, it's translated into increased productivity or reducing costs. And yeah, sure, it reduces costs and improves productivity, 5, 10, 20%, whatever. But the real value is in how much more value that you're producing over a given period of time. Right? With Agile, people say, well, you're cheating, you're cutting corners, you're not shipping everything that we would traditionally. That's a good thing, right? If over a year, I would normally ship 100 features and I would get $100, but if I only ship, 50, I'm going to make $80. Then why would I spend the next 6 months doing $20? The ROI over time doesn't make any sense, right? So understanding for the organization what the business value of Agile is, I think, is a big impediment that often, IT or the software development group is looked at as a cost center, and so there's not a lot of motivation to make organizational change and that kind of thing. So that's one of the things that I focus on early on is saying, hey, let's talk about where the real value is and what are the impediments in the way there. Get that early education to motivate people, and then get some early wins to motivate them to make more changes at the organizational level. Because standing up teams, that's not that hard. Getting them to stay stood up and producing business value, that's hard.
Thanks, Damon. That's all the time we have planned for, so respecting everybody's time. So thank you all of you for attending today's webinar, and again, thank you, Damon, for being the featured presenter. We'll see you again in the next webinar, most likely next month.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.